My name is Rachel Locke. I'm the Director of International Interventions at the National Network for Safe Communities. I have been with the organization for about a year and a half, and we obviously have spent most of the morning talking about NNSC partnership with communities and cities across the U.S. and in the U.S. context, and that is where our work obviously began. That's where we remain rooted, but there have been several requests for partnership or for collaboration in countries and cities outside the U.S. And about a year ago, the organization, a little over, made a decision to formalize that and to actually kind of create a community of practice, if you will, or a practice area that's focused on international engagement. So that's my position now, that's my role, and what we have here with this panel is some of those countries and individuals who represent countries that we've started to have partnership conversations with. I just want to say a couple things, and then we're going to go straight into the panel. One of the things that I want to start with is saying how excited I am about the NNSC's venture into the international space as somebody who has worked in international conflict and violence for the entirety of my career. I have seen again and again the worst of U.S. policy being exported, and I think that there's an opportunity here to bring some of the best of U.S. practice to other places, and also to bring some of the best of practice that's happening in other countries into the U.S. context. So when we're thinking about partnerships, we're really thinking about a two-way street, one of both learning from what's happening in other contexts and challenging ourselves, and thinking collaboratively about what our tools and our thinking and our practices can contribute to non-U.S. contexts. None of that will look cookie cutter, right? I mean, we say this all the time, that we are very committed to particular principles and very flexible when we talk about adaptation, right? So legitimacy is extremely important, we believe, when it comes to issues of violence, and that's true whether you're talking about relationships between police and communities in Milwaukee, or whether you're talking about conflict and civil war type violence in South Sudan. So figuring out what legitimacy means and what enhancing legitimacy would look like in a context like El Salvador, or Bermuda, or Honduras, or Sweden, some of the countries represented here today, is a question mark, right? And that's why we are starting to work with some of the partners that you see here and many, many others, is to try to figure out how these principles that we hold dear will translate in other contexts. Let me just say one final thing, which is for those of you who don't track kind of global trends, right now the world has a higher number of displaced refugee and seekers of asylum than at any time since the creation of the United Nations. It's over 65 million people globally. Every day, I believe, in Latin America and the Caribbean, there are 400 homicides. That's every single day in that region. We're seeing an increase in violence at the same time that some are saying we're seeing a decrease in conflict. So what this means for the peace-building community, what this means in terms of how we address rates of violence that are creating massive shifts and massive population movements that are, in many countries, confronting our own ideas about how we provide assistance and help and service to the international community, is a big question mark right now. So I think having a kind of global picture in our mind is really important, but of course that's just made up of city blocks and communities and neighborhoods. So with that framing, we're going to go right into our panel. I think you guys have bios of everybody, is that right? Great. So I'm not going to do the bios of everyone because that would eat up 10 minutes in and of itself. But I do want to start with Erik Wennerström from Sweden, from the National Council, the head of the National Council on Crime Prevention. So some people may be surprised, I think, to see Sweden represented here. We think of Sweden as a relatively safe country without a lot of high violence problems. Your office is responsible for collecting data and statistics and information about crime in Sweden. Can you give folks in this room a picture, a sense of what's happening in Sweden and maybe how things have changed recently?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having invited me here. I'm delighted to be here. Yes, Sweden may be a surprising place to start the discussions about the challenges of effective violence prevention, but although Sweden is comparatively a safe country with a relatively low rate of crime, when it comes to lethal violence, it's in parity with other Western European countries. But the worrying and disturbing development is something that we have seen over the past decade or so, is mainly focused to certain socially challenged areas in our 3 metropolitan areas and other mid-sized cities in the country. In these areas, we see a high degree of social exclusion and unemployment, poor education records, poorer health than in other parts of the society. So most of our services in society are created for the situation as it was prior to this development. So we did not, when it started to develop, we did not have the mechanisms in place in order to take care of the problem, which then was permitted to escalate. These areas are the recipients of a great chunk of all asylum seekers that come to Sweden. The areas are already socially challenged when they arrive, and by definition, asylum seekers will be excluded from the labor market and excluded from other services, which adds on to this problem. So you will find areas with a high degree of fear, a high degree of exposure to crime, low confidence for the police and other agencies of the state. Now, what we've seen recently is social unrest and public demonstrations of violence in these areas, hurting people and risking to hurt bystanders as well. There's been shootings, there's been hand grenades have been thrown into dwellings. Drug deals are carried out in the open, and in some of the areas we also have a very high concentration of criminals, certain parallel structures of society and extremism. Some of these areas have in the past years been the recruiting ground for approximately, it's a bit more than 350 persons who have gone on to fight for Daesh or ISIS in Syria. Persons that, well, at least some of them are likely to return at one point, which is going to add on to this difficulty. Now, in numbers, the persons that are generating the criminal activity often formed into loose gangs of fairly young persons, sometimes reacting with their shooting violence for competitive battles for drug markets, but in other instances reacting to insults or perceived provocations from other young persons or other gangs. They are very few in numbers, but their activities have tended to characterize some of these areas, which really adds on to the problem itself. They are stigmatized through the activities of these small bands of persons, the whole areas will be stigmatized, and we have only started to design methods, both from law enforcement and from the social side of society, to address these problems. But we're at the starting point, and that is one of the reasons that we are so glad for the cooperation with NNSC. We're in dire need of knowledge.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up question, which is curious to me, and something actually that I think is curious to other people in the room, which is that my limited knowledge of Sweden, having been there just a few times, or perception is that the social service sector is quite good, actually, and quite robust. So one of the things that you talked about was there have been some challenges in integrating new asylum seekers into those existing systems. I suppose the question is how, what has been tried, and what gaps have been identified, or what are people trying to do to make that work better for new asylum seekers that are, especially in the city of Malmö, which, as you said, has 90% of all people coming to Sweden through.
Well, as you say, a lot has been tried and a lot has been successful. There is for this small group of persons that are furthest away from inclusion into the society. For them, no effective method has so far been designed. We have methods designed for persons willing to interact with society, willing to be part of a joint effort to, for instance, steer the behavior of a young man back into society. But when there is no mutual will or no confidence in the services that are being offered, or when the services being offered are clearly insufficient, it is for those instances that we are seeking new ways of addressing the problem, because the tools we have at the moment are simply insufficient.
Yeah, it's interesting. So let me just do a process note, which I should have done at the beginning, but I'll do it now because better late than never. The way that this panel is going to work is I'll ask a series of questions and then actually give time for the panelists to ask questions of one another, and then we'll have time for what I hope will be actual kind of dialogue and conversation with all of you, particularly since it's not a massive room. We should be able to do this. And I think that there are some really interesting questions here around social service provision in particular, because I think in the US we also struggle with delivery of social service help and support to individuals, and even a place like Sweden that we probably think of as doing much better in that regard struggles. So there might be some interesting parallels there. Enrique, as somebody who used to have a senior position in the government of Mexico and is now responsible for working on a large violence prevention project in Mexico, one of the things that Eric talked about was how there's a small number of people actually who are responsible not just for violence, but through their actions create sort of stigma, I think was the word that you used, of a community, right? So a community gets stigmatized as being a dangerous area or bad area. Can you talk for a minute about Mexico City specifically, so not the whole country of Mexico, but Mexico City specifically, and what are the kind of violence dynamics or patterns that you see there? Do you see similarities with what Eric was just talking about? And give us, kind of paint a picture of your experience there.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity of being here. Thanks, Rachel, because this is a great opportunity for me, not only to be here with the National Network, but also with sharing with the table with colleagues that we have tried to work together for many years, or that we have met earlier in this effort to put together sound violence reduction strategies in our countries, in our own contexts, inspired by what the national network is doing. I think the question about Mexico City is relevant because Mexico, as you know, it's a very large country. As you may know from following the international media, there's this perception that Mexico it's a country that's going through an incredible amount of violence. Yes, the rate of violence in Mexico has grown exponentially in the last years. But also it's very important to understand that this problem has grades of gray, or tones of gray, I'm sorry. Tones of gray in the country. We have, for example, cities like Acapulco with 130 homicides per 100,000, the most violent city in the country right now, whereas we have Mérida, Yucatan with a homicide rate of 3 homicides per 100,000. Mexico City, it's in the lower range of cities in terms of homicide rates. It's a city with 14 homicides per 100,000. For example, compared to Chicago, that's half the rate of Chicago, right? Something that might surprise people who are not used to follow statistics from these countries. So that's the first thing to know. Now, having said that, Mexico City has half the rate of Chicago and 60% of what Mexico has as a country, we can also see that the concentration of homicides in the city is very, very steep in some places. There's one particular police district called Morelos, for example, that has a homicide rate of 80 homicides per 100,000. So while the city has 12, this very particular hotspot has a homicide rate of 80. Again, if you connect and overlap geography with demographics, young men living in this particular district experience a homicide rate above 300 homicides per 100,000. So the question here in terms of Mexico City is, if you design a policy, if you design an intervention to address this problem, would you address it with the 14 homicides across the city, or would you design it to intervene in very particular cases where you have some populations experiencing 300 homicides per 100,000, not going to the granular understanding or just classifying them as active gang members, just young men, generally speaking, in these hotspots experience these levels of violence. So I think that's how Mexico separates from the rest of the country in so many ways, but at the same time experiences some of these places, some of these hotspots, rates of violence that are unacceptable.
Mexico as a country is also going through a significant reform process in terms of its criminal justice system overall, if I'm not correct. And I know that I've heard you say before, and we talk a lot about, you can do things today that effectively bring violence down while there's a process of reform simultaneously happening. In other words, we don't have to wait until everything is completely reformed as though there's an end date to that before we can take action that can have impact. And I've heard you talk about that in the Mexico context, avoiding discussions of sort of broader police reform, and also talking about the challenge of creating certainty, right? So that if you deliver a message, if you deliver communication about both stop the violence, you're doing harm, this needs to stop, but also about offers of help, that you need to create certainty that those messages will be followed up on. Could you maybe elaborate on both of those things, which I've heard you talk about?
Yes,
before?
absolutely. I don't know if this is the case in Sweden, but something that I learned very quickly working for the federal government of Mexico is that when you have national conversations, when you have discussions happening in Mexico City, but looking at the country as a whole, you tend to aggregate information very quickly and make jumping to conclusions that tend to not fit every case. I think one of the conclusions and the views, the centralized views that happen from national governments, many times has to do with the fact that you want to change the country as a whole, and you engage in long-term reforms, which are obviously very necessary. I mean, no one in Mexico can say that we have the justice system that we want, or that we have the police that we want. And I do not intend to say that engaging ourselves in these long-term processes is not critical and important. But I think that at the same time, there's stuff to be done today, and something that we have learned through experiences like the one from the National Network of Safer Communities is that you don't need to have a fully reformed justice system. You don't need to have a fully reformed, if such a thing exists, of your police force to really start getting success on the ground. I think the closer you get to the ground, the closer you get to work with these communities. I have this incredible experience. After working for the federal government, I had the chance to spend a year in New Haven, Connecticut. And I remember, walking the streets of New Haven and seeing the same experiences. I mean, the same type of things that I saw in Ciudad Juarez back in the day when I was working for the Mexican government. The same type of expressions from the youth and the same type of dynamics that I saw in the outskirts of Mexico City, of Ciudad Juarez, I saw in New Haven. Completely different contexts, right? I mean, one is a desert, very poor. The other, you could say, is poor relative to the U.S., but very different in many ways. But when you go to the granular experience of these places, there's the fundamental injustice that David was referring to in his presentation. So my point here is that you really just need the commitment of a small group of committed people to put together these type of strategies. And my job right now in Mexico is to say, guys, yes, let's continue focusing on these long-term efforts, but let's do something today on the ground. Let's bring partners together, and let's address this issue right now.
So you might get some questions about New Haven, since we have New Haven represented here during the Q&A, but one really quick follow-up, which is, as somebody who has that experience of being in the government in another country and then being here in the U.S. in an academic capacity, but also a practitioner capacity, do you see value in the kind of international connections based on your experience that you just described, right? Having seen similar faces on the people and similar kind of circumstances in New Haven and Mexico City. Does that matter at all? Is there value in recognizing those similarities, and what is the value? What should we do with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously we are kind of trained now to say the context matters, right? And that's true. The context is very important. But also there are some fundamentals. When I'm an urbanist, and I remember when I was doing research on urbanism, and you start measuring the size of neighborhoods in China, in Mexico, in the US, wherever you do research on what the size of the neighborhood is, it tends to be the same everywhere. And the only thing that's a constant there is human scale. Because you walk, we all walk, and we have certain capacity to engage with X number of people at the same time. So neighborhoods tends to be the same, and that's something fundamental in the way we operate as a society. I think many things that the focus deterrence approach address touches on those fundamentals, and that's why I strongly believe that applying some of these concepts, or all of them, in a very contextualized way makes a lot of sense. Even more so, I think one of the premises here is that the national network on the focus deterrence approach starts with an understanding that there are limited resources to do stuff. You have a limited amount of force, you have a limited amount of budget, time to implement. And I think this is even more the case in countries like Mexico, or even more in Central America, where you have to really maximize the good officers that you have. You have to maximize the good judges that you have working for you. You have civil society trained, capable of addressing these places. I think that's when it even makes more sense.
That's perfect, because you just set me up for a wonderful segue into Central America. So both El Salvador and Honduras in the past few years have unfortunately ranked as the countries with the highest homicide rates in the world. Neither is in the #1 spot right now. I believe that's Venezuela.
No, it's El Salvador.
Is it El Salvador? Forget what I just said. It's El Salvador. Really? Okay, that's unfortunate. Honduras has slipped out of the #1 spot, which we're happy about, and we're going to hear in a minute from Kurt part of the story of how they slipped out of the #1 spot. But so, Jeremy, working for a U.S. government agency that in part has to do with what Enrique just talked about, right, which is identifying those areas that really work and prioritizing very scarce resources. Can you just talk a little bit about what kind of we're seeing in El Salvador right now, not just in terms of violence, because, you know, starting from Sweden and where Sweden is, and then thinking about, well, you know, could similar principles apply in a context like Sweden versus a context like El Salvador, and what does that look like, and is it even possible? Should we be thinking along those lines? Tell us a little bit about the context in El Salvador and whether you think some of the principles of legitimacy, of a focus on deterrence, of being more strategic with our enforcement tools and resources, does that apply in El Salvador, and how? I think it's on already.
Sorry. Absolutely, I would say yes from the get-go. Of course, this is something that I vacillate on quite a bit, and as you know, we're actually embarking on a feasibility study of El Salvador to really look at responsibly approaching some of the focus deterrence principles to see what can actually translate to the context. I'm not going to mince words. El Salvador is a very different environment. It has a different group situation, group dynamic. It has a different violence dynamic. With the groups, it's almost monolithically across the country. The violence is driven by two groups, and they're gangs that we know here in the U.S. as well, MS-13 and 18th Street. You know, it traces back to the Civil War period in El Salvador from 79 to 92. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans fled to the U.S. Many took root in Los Angeles, formed gangs, joined gangs. U.S. deportation policies shifted following the end of the Civil War, and a lot of people with gang ties were sent back to a context that actually provided very fertile ground for them to consolidate and become a force to be reckoned with. Why a force to be reckoned with? Well, you know, there's the government of El Salvador and the national level response. And again, I know that the local context, I think, is key when we're looking at where this can actually be done, but I'm going to speak about national mostly in the case of El Salvador because, truth be told, it's smaller in square miles than the New York metropolitan area. It's smaller in population. Most of the key institutions that would need to be involved, AG, forensics, police, are all national at the national level. So we tend to think in those terms. But the government's primary response has been repressive. You know, from most of the 2000s have been mano dura, super mano dura, hard-hitting, very punitive approaches that have exacerbated the situation, that have led to a lot more criminalization of a lot of young people, that have really marginalized a large swathe of the population and have really helped gangs, these two primary gangs in particular, seize territorial control to such a degree that just a few years ago in 2012, they were able to bring the government itself to a negotiating table to negotiate a stay in violence in exchange for better prison conditions. That's political power. So that transcends just the normal kinds of violence that you would tend to see from a lot of the groups that we deal with. Truce fell apart, and 2015, as we know, became the most homicidal year in the country's history, even more homicidal than any year during the conflict, 103 per 100,000 nationwide. Some days where there were over 40 homicides a day in a country of a little over 6 million people. It's been, it has taken a heavy toll. You know, the new administration that came in 2014 devised a response that was really intended to look at hotspots, you know, the 50 municipalities that accounted, of the 262 in the country, that accounted for 72% of the country's homicides. That's a smart approach. but it quickly devolved into mano dura again. If not in word, definitely in deed. The Supreme Court ruled gang affiliation and gang collaboration as a terrorist offense, which has of course led to a lot of roundups, a lot of people in jail, 300% prison overpopulation, 50% are pretrial detainees. A lot of issues with that. Also extraordinary measures, so rescinding the terms of the gang truce, putting gang leaders back in maximum security prisons, cutting off their communications, fractured a lot of the communication channels between gang leadership and a lot of the kind of street crews. So now violence is even touching parts of the country where it had not been. So 2014, there were 23 municipalities in the country that had 0 homicides, mostly rural. Now, most recently, we're under 10. So it's spreading out. So we're seeing that deconcentration. And part of the challenge is also just that we don't know a lot. The national level data, the police data, is notoriously flawed, and this is not unique to El Salvador. I think this is a challenge we face across all of Latin America. But we need to start doing a better job of synthesizing the human intelligence piece with the hard data. But again, that's something that will bring us more to the highly localized level. But the real challenge is our service providers. There are very few service providers working in anything but the primary prevention space. Reentry doesn't really exist. There are maybe a few faith-based organizations across the country that are engaging in that, and frankly, because of the terrorism designation, there are concerns about legal repercussions. You have police legitimacy issues, which is another big issue. There are extrajudicial killings. In fact, there have been about over 500 in the past few years. So police have formed death squads on their off hours, but then again, looking at it rationally, as horrifying as that is from a human rights perspective, police are being targeted as well as their families. They have no mental counseling. There are no such resources that exist. I think the rhetoric has devolved into something that is war. It's warlike. You have issues with rampant impunity, which is another big challenge. A small fraction of homicide cases result in convictions. I can go on and on about the challenges, but I think going back to the initial point, I don't want to rule out that focused deterrence and some of these key principles can be helpful. Why? First of all, the zero tolerance approach that's being unleashed is not a good use of law enforcement resources, especially in a kind of a limited resource setting. Selective targeting would be enormously more helpful, and especially the key of focused deterrence being on the behaviors and not on the identity. If the country could somehow make that leap, I think there would be a lot more progress, not only on the violence front, but also on the healing side. Because you can't underestimate some of the real grievances that these gang members have in terms of why they are and why they're so embedded in communities. Lastly, just one challenge I wanted to also flag in the case of El Salvador, because it's very unique. As homicidal as the country is right now, if you ask an average community member, that's not really what their primary concern is. It's being constantly victimized by extortion. So to have people rally around an approach that's chief objective is violence reduction is still far from, the jury's still out. And Rachel knows this very well, and Enrique as well, because we've actually have gone to the region on multiple occasions to have these conversations. So I'll stop there.
So a somewhat bleak picture, I would say, but with pockets of hope. And I think what's interesting about having Kurt speak next from the Honduras perspective is that I would say many people also perhaps still put Honduras in that bleak perspective basket, but there has been some very real progress that has been made in a context that many people may have just written off, right? So I hear and have heard in El Salvador a sort of, well, it's so far gone, the gangs are so far gone, all we can do is lock them all up, throw away the key, kill them, if we kill them, that's fine. And to be able to say that there are ways to make progress, I think is really powerful and important. So, Kurt, your organization has been in Honduras operating with very difficult conditions for a long time and has had really important and really significant impact both at the local level and now kind of at the national level with what you're doing with police and the purges of the police department. I think I want to ask you to take a minute, if you will, to sort of tell the story of the origins of the Association for More Just Society. I can't say it in Spanish, so I won't, but you're welcome to say it in Spanish. And I think what struck me about it when I first heard it was just the theme of realizing that it's a very small number of individuals, which goes back, again, to something that Eric said at the very beginning, and it's kind of a theme. So you could tell us how you all began.
Thanks, Rachel, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. Yeah, it's a little bit always of a hard story for me to tell, but hopefully it's a hopeful story too, so I will tell it. My family and I moved into what we didn't know then, but it was the most violent neighborhood in Honduras, 35,000 people and 52 homicides in 2005, so a homicide rate of like 130 in our neighborhood. And we moved there in part because my best friend and co-founder of AGS, Carlos Hernandez, had moved there a couple of years earlier. And one night I came home about 9 o'clock at night, and my kids were crying, and I didn't know what was going on. And my wife said, well, they said that their friend's dad was killed this morning. And so I went over to Carlos, who lived right next door, and he was the principal of the school. And I said, is this true? And he said, yeah. He sold fruits and vegetables out of the back of a pickup truck. And probably, if you've been to Latin America, you've seen that. So he maybe had $100 in his pocket. He was going in the morning to buy fruits and vegetables. And three guys encapuchados, or like ski masks, came up to him and told him to give him his money. And he did. And after they took his money, they shot him in the head and killed him in front of his kids and wife. And was sad. I went home, calmed my kids down, said our prayers, and kind of the next day sort of forgot about it. But 3 days later, Carlos came to my house that the widow had come to him. He was the principal of the school. The kids were in his school, and so the widow said, I have two witnesses who saw them take their face masks off. We know where they live. It's about 3 blocks from here. We know their names. We know who they are. We know where they live. What should we do? And the reason they had come to Carlos and not to the police is sort of what you can all guess, right? There was no trust in the police. And then we didn't just go to the police for the same reason, right? Like, we didn't know if the neighborhood cops would have connections to these guys. They could be they could actually be cops who are off duty. So we tried to, Carlos called some friends, I called friends. Nobody else knew how to connect us to anybody that they trusted in the police force right away either. So time starts to go by. And several months ended up going by. We actually kept working at it, but never fixed it. And these same 3 guys ended up killing an off-duty cop. Some other cops saw them, chased them back into our neighborhood. They holed up into a house. There was like a standoff. One of them was shot, and 2 of them were arrested. So a few days later, Carlos and I were having tea at his house, and we started talking, and I said, those guys were really bad. This happened in our neighborhood, but these seemed especially bad. And I was like, I know that they killed at least 1, 2, and 3. And Carlos says, I didn't even know about 1, 2, and 3, but I knew about 4 and 5 and 6. So we ended up starting to do a little research, and we ended up coming up with 13 names from the time we knew who they were to the time that they were arrested and shot. So, like, that's awful, right? 13, all of them men, most of them fathers, dads, husbands, were killed, and we knew who the guys were, and we didn't do anything about it, or we didn't do much about it. So we ended up just saying next time we were going to do something, and we didn't know anything about all this. This was in 2004. So very predictably, a new gang sprung up several months later, and this was younger kids, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and started doing much of the same thing. And what we ended up doing was we hired an ex-cop and an ex-prosecutor, and a little later a psychologist. And we asked our ex-cop to find victims, witnesses, families, and convince them that they could do something and that we would help them. And the lawyer, who was an ex-prosecutor, would work with the DA's office. And so it took several months to convince our first witnesses that we could help them get police, because an ex-cop knew who the good cops were and the bad cops were in the police force. And we started building these bridges of trust between the community and the authorities. And we ended up finding, just like other people have said, that the community didn't trust the cops, but the cops also didn't trust the communities, because they would have to go into a gang member's house, break down the door. Usually it was 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, try and catch them asleep. But they had guns, and people would get shot, and the cops had families, and then, the witnesses wouldn't even show up, right? 24 hours later, they'd have to show up, and 6 months for their first hearing, and 2 years later for the trial. So the cops are risking their lives, and the witnesses don't show up, and then everybody's blaming everybody. And so we ended up, by 2009, we dropped the homicide rate in our neighborhood from 52 to 7. So just with 3 people, actually 2 people most of that time, 1 ex-cop and 1 ex-prosecutor, just working, building confidence and trust with the neighborhood. And now we've spread that out. We have neighborhoods in San Pedro Sula, about 100,000 people, Tegucigalpa, about 100,000 people that are in our programs. Same sort of stuff. Violence, probably the gangs are much more embedded in El Salvadoran culture, but same neighborhoods. We're in one in San Pedro Sula called Rivera Hernandez, and everybody said, there's no way you can do that in Rivera Hernandez. And so we took the 4 most violent neighborhoods within Rivera Hernandez, and we had a 4-month stretch within our first 8 months that there were 0 homicides in those 4 neighborhoods. So I think, it's a story of hope that you can do this even in crazy violent places. And I think we're all learning together how to do that better.
Yeah, exactly. Can I ask you, I want to make sure I have enough time for our colleagues from Bermuda, but I want to give you just a minute to talk a little bit about the police reform process that's been going on in Honduras and the role that your organization has been playing in that.
Yeah, I just peeked at my notes. So Honduras has 3%, I don't think we call it clearance rate in Honduras, but we have 97% of the homicides are never solved in Honduras. 3% are solved. And in our neighborhoods, we're at about 70-30. So we're solving about 30% of the homicides in our neighborhoods. We're 3% at the national level, so like 10 times as high. So I think maybe the opposite of what Enrique was saying, there was no national level effort going on. And so there was some very high level, very high profile murders in 2011, 2012. The president of the National University's son was killed by police on duty in uniform. They tried to carjack his car and ended up killing him to try and cover it up. And so that started a whole effort. We formed a coalition of the Catholic Church, Protestant Church, World Vision, some of the biggest NGOs, and for 5 years have been pushing for a bunch of stuff, but the biggest was the police need to be purged. We need to get rid of the bad apples. And it took, basically 4 years before, again, every time there was a new case, a new high-profile case of police killing people, often in uniform on duty, it would be a new push. And the latest push came a little over a year ago. And the president ended up naming representatives of our coalition to a commission to purge the police. And as of last month, they have fired 5,000 of 12,000 police officers in the country. So almost half of the police force has been fired. And very pleasantly, surprisingly, the international community had already put in place a process for training and hiring new cops. So we also have added about 6,000 new police trained with the Swiss curriculum. If the Swiss did it, it must be good, right? So, so we've fired 5,000 and they've added 6,000 in the last 2 years. So, so it is hopeful. Honduras is, and the homicide rate is down about 40% from 2012.
Very helpful. And I think goes back to the point we were talking about earlier about being able to make progress even when there's not reform, but sometimes that can create space for a larger reform process, which I think is a little bit of the story of Honduras. I'm going to switch now to a context that's very dissimilar in many ways, but similar, I would say, also in other ways from what we've been talking about, which is Bermuda, which is an island of 68,000?
64
or 5,000 people. I'm not on top of my statistics today.
Close.
And has a history. We were speaking earlier this morning with Kim, who was talking about growing up, and I think in a period of 30 years maybe, not remembering a single homicide, right? So a small island, tight community, not a history of high levels of violence. Jeff, as the Minister of National Security, you, I think, have been really kind of at the front of trying to bring new and meaningful ways to address the recent increase that Bermuda has seen in violence. Can you talk a little bit about, even though the rates are, when compared to other contexts, relatively low, because it's such a small island, what does the relatively recent increase in violence mean to the community, and how has it impacted the island overall? And I guess what have you been trying to do to address the violence?
Sure, that's like 10 questions in one, Rachel.
That's the way I do it.
No, that's fine. I thank you for everyone for coming to this. I know you had 2 other choices, and by far this panel has the best accents. I know that for a fact, so thank you for choosing us. Bermuda. I will talk about the impact. I will talk about what it means to us, but I want to end again on not just where the roadblocks are, but what some of the solutions that we've identified together, because there is a lot of hope in Bermuda. In the last 10 years, we've had 36 homicides. We've had 125 young men, young black males, shot and injured. We have 51 young black males who've been convicted of serious firearms or homicide offenses. We have 23 of those young black males serving life sentences right now in our corrections facility. And we have the latest immigration statistics, over 220, we think, plus or minus 5, young black Bermudians who have left the jurisdiction altogether, who have moved to the United Kingdom. All of these people are between the ages of 18 and 32. All of them are people of color. And if you do a back of the napkin addition, it's about 455 people we have lost in our community. 455, all between the ages of 18 and 32. Whether they've been killed, whether they've been incarcerated, or they've left the jurisdiction for their own safety. That is our challenge right now in Bermuda. And I think admitting that and facing that is step one. Bermuda, if some of you are surprised by some of these things I'm saying, it's for good reason. We are known for our tourism product. We are known for being a safe island. We are known for being beautiful and all other things. See me outside, I have a great sales pitch, hour and a half away from JFK, but I'll save that. That is our challenge, and we have some roadblocks. And one of those is our isolation. Bermuda, for those of you who don't know, is actually not in the Caribbean. Its closest point of land is Cape Hatteras, 618, I believe, miles due west. So we are completely isolated. So that's strategically advantageous, and that's also a massive problem. And it becomes a problem when you have internal issues, such as this. Why? Because when we look at honorable exits, when we look at even witness protection, that's non-existent. You cannot do witness protection in an island where you iron your jeans to go to the grocery store because you will know someone at the grocery store, and if you look terrible on the Sunday morning, then you will be ridiculed in public. That is just how we are, right? Yeah, Kim knows. So it's way too small. That is a major challenge. Politics, that's another challenge as well, simply because we have to do better at confronting inequalities, race issues, of course, jobs. Those are major contemporary issues in Bermuda right now, political issues. The future is our challenge. Why? Because I gave you those stats of the 455 people who are no longer in our jurisdiction for whatever reason. Because of those homicides, 36 homicides, as a result of them, there are 62 children who are now fatherless. And I'm just talking about the homicides. There are 62 of them who are fatherless. And 90% of those children are under the age of 10. And so when we talk about the future of our children in Bermuda, not only the now of this tremendous impact that they have that we're not treating systemically, but going forward, if we save half of them, which would probably be a good success story, half of them, we'd still have 30 that wants to do harm in the name of some cultural transmission or because my dad was killed. And success is also being a roadblock. I mentioned a couple of months ago some statistics, and I won't bore you here with it, but in about 2 or 3 years ago, we saw a dip in the level of violence and homicide. And because of that, I won't say little, but there was less focus and then therefore budget applied to public safety because it was deemed, well, I think we're getting this right, yet not really doing anything dramatically different. And I say that as the former Deputy Minister for National Security as well. So those are our challenges, those are our roadblocks and solutions. Well, the first solution we quickly identified was we needed to pivot towards a social engagement. Now I know that sounds like an obtuse political slogan. It probably is. But what does that mean? So in 2013, in month one of my appointment into the Senate as the junior Deputy Minister for National Security, I found myself in a living room in Pembroke on Happy Valley Road. It's actually a road I grew up on, working class Portuguese family. I knew Marilyn, and I knew that her son was killed the night before. And he was killed in a double murder as he was stocking the shelves of a small convenience store. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had previously been caught up in this stuff. But I sat in her living room and was speaking with her, and there was a lot of activity. This is normally the case, people coming in, offering condolences. Hassaje Haile, who's the murdered young man, had a son. He was 8 years old. I have an 8-year-old son. Hassaje was 8 years old when I met him. He was on the couch crying. And what I saw in the next 20 minutes or so completely changed my entire focus and even worldview on how these problems need to be addressed. And that's why I'm sitting here today. And so briefly, this person who was killed was a reggae artist, very popular. He had just released an album, and of course his songs were on the radio all day, all week. And as I sat there in her living room with just Hassaje, who was crying, and the grandmother, of course one of his songs came on. And I found myself in this uncomfortable position of, should I leave and give them this moment? And she just danced with this 8-year-old slowly in the middle of this living room for the entire song. And I sat there and watched this. And right after the song ended, 3, what they would be called in the law enforcement community, prolific priority offenders walked in. These were the top gang members of this area. And they said to her in front of me, Mom, she's the elder of the community, what should we do? And she said, sit down, get a drink, and relax. We don't want any more violence. And the 3 of them, they took off their helmets, they sat down, and that was the beginning of my Google searches of ceasefire, David Kennedy, and why I'm here. Because that's social engagement. She could have said, I want you to go and kill those sons of bitches. And that would have been it. That would have been it. They did not care that I was in the room. That would have been it. So we've done a few things as a result. Not only have we, thankfully, we've partnered with the national network here, but we have done a few initiatives inside Bermuda, cash back to communities. We've taken $1 million of confiscated assets and given it right back to the community. I mean, directly. We've rebuilt playgrounds. We have given children new soccer uniforms. We have engaged in centers of influence in the community, helped fund them directly from the confiscated assets from criminals, not taxpayer money. We have gang resistance training inside of schools now for the ages of 8, 9, 10, and 11. We're addressing conflict model management, but it's also about bullying and gang behavior, because we know that we need to pull them away from this lifestyle. We just cannot continue in a law enforcement perspective. We have to do social crime reductions as well and pull them away from this. It's really this soft power and legitimacy. 10-year-old who comes from a harmed community might actually think that it's more legitimate and rational for them to join and be a part of a gang than it is to become an actuary in the international business sector in Bermuda. And Street Safe, which is kind of a segue into what Kim is doing. We've launched Team Street Safe with our outreach workers, and they're doing an amazing job, a quiet job, and often an invisible job. So it's hard to talk about some of those success stories. I know that she will, and she deserves to. But you know, it's been an absolute pleasure working with Kim in the last 4 years, and now we're finally sitting here with some contemporaries from around the world with different accents, because we're really hopeful that we are going to make some significant changes in Bermuda's population, because the timing is ripe, because the community is saying we've actually had enough. And they're no longer apologists about where these young men have come from, and hey, maybe they're doing this because they were harmed, or they don't have jobs, or they're done with that. But that's only been in the last couple of months, and that's only been because we've been able to penetrate, engage, and empower the communities.
So that is a perfect segue. Thank you for making my job easier again. You guys are a great panel. To Kim and the work that you've been doing with the Mirrors program, which I understand is directed more at younger population, a population that's more at risk than necessarily already engaged in violence and criminal activity. And you've got really good data and literature to back up the successes that you've seen. But how do you see engaging in those who are already kind of caught up in violence? And what have you been doing? The outreach work is a part of that, but can you talk a little bit more about where you're going from that perspective?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for being here as well, inviting me here. We have been doing some exciting work in Bermuda with the Mirrors program. It's where it started, and it was the population that we didn't think we would really have access to. They had falling through the cracks, and they weren't being successful in the traditional social services arena. And so we actually wrapped around that population coaches or supports from the community that connected with them, and we were rigorous about training them and connecting with them, that really had them build trust and relationships with another adult. And through that period, over a 9-month period, we literally saw the transformation of their lives, because these are young people who were falling out of failing school, were on the verge of dropping out of school, were involved in crime, the early stages of crime, and had anger management issues. And through that connection with that adult population, they seemed to turn things around. And we decided that we're going to follow them after the program, and we have followed them. We're 10 years in now. We follow them at the 6 months period, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years. And at 2 years, we found that 92% of them are law-abiding citizens, so they had not reoffended. 82% of them graduated from high school. They were on the verge of failing and dropping out, but 2 years had graduated. 24% of them had actually gone on to higher learning when there wasn't even a possibility or dream for them. And about 40 or 44% of them are employed. So when we look back at what we did with those young people and connecting them with a healthy adult and working not a mentorship perspective, but a coaching perspective, working with them on what do you want for your life, and then they get to put that in place, and then we worked with them from that perspective. So we took that same model to the Team Street Safe, to a group we didn't think we had access to. And by engaging, going up to Boston actually and seeing the Boston Street Safe model, and then engaging outreach workers to go out into the community to engage with these young men, it was about building relationships. So just working with them, meeting them where they were at, listening to them, listening to their needs, and then going and advocating for those services to support their needs. The challenges is that the 18 to 30-year-old, at 18 in Bermuda, you age out of services. And for the 18 to 30-year-old males that require some support because they've dropped out of school, there are no services, very limited services for them. And the limitation of services is if they have a record that they could get service through court services or through incarceration, that's where all the services are. So I want you to see that's a punitive society. We wait until you get bad enough, and here's all the services for you. So we needed to look at how do we create and open up the services at the community level for these young men, because as we started to engage with them, we recognized they needed education. We recognized their number one request was jobs. And so they were unskilled, and we needed vocational training. We had 0 vocational training organizations in Bermuda. We do have a workforce development, which is a public unit, but that unit really is about resources or retraining the workforce versus the people who are unskilled or underskilled, getting them connected to jobs. So there isn't the intensity level of support to work them from uneducated, unskilled, to how do I get an entry-level position. So we found ourselves doing that work as well. And it's intensive because you've got men now coming in and you don't have resources, so you have to be creative. So we got creative, and we engaged those organizations to come out to the young men to try and work avenues for them to get access to jobs. We did Bermuda Economic Development Corporation, which teaches entrepreneurship. They did workshops with them about vendoring. However, the level is a bit higher than what was needed for these young men. So we recognize that there are an intensity level of mentoring or coaching that's required for them being successful in that type of training. You can't put them in a training. They can get the information, they can't apply the information. So you need the mentorship to help walk them through the process. When we did that for a small section of the young men, we saw success. But it was a challenge because the community was not ready to accept these young men. And so it's been difficult getting volunteers for the young men. So it's easier to get the volunteers for the 15 to 18-year-old. It's more challenging to get the volunteers for the 18 to 30-year-old. It's easier to get resources for the 15 to 18-year-old. It's difficult to get resources for the 18+. So what we recognize is that there is a need for more community readiness. And so while we have been plowing the streets and working with the young men and opening up some doors, we're now getting more young men coming in, but we don't have the resources to support them. And so the fear is that we will start to do the same thing that they see the system has done to them previously. I come in for services, I ask for things, I'm here wanting to make a difference, wanting to change my life, and you let me down as well. So it has been exciting since we came up to the Ceasefire University one-day overview training, because it has opened up, or beginning to open up, the community to work to support these young men. The 19 members that went back have talked about the possibility of ceasefire, has empowered their small groups. We have a social convening on June the 22nd of social services that we have been trying to do for 10 years to begin to look at and map what are the services for the 18 to 30-year-old black males. And we know there's one, Team Street Safe. But we think we know we have to go through the process because we need them to have the aha moment that we need to look at how can we service these young men in our community by changing or expanding our services. Because you can get services from those social services if you have a child, so they treat child and families. But the young males generally are not working and oftentimes excluded from the nucleus or the young moms, so they're not accessible to those child and family services that's being offered. So we want to raise the awareness, and the hope is that, we'll begin to set a priority for resources to be allocated to this population. So as a result of being in the street, working with the young men, engaging them, getting them to come in, listening to their stories, pushing on the social services, we're getting some traction. That's the one thing. The next thing is that the GVI process is going to provide a framework and a focus for us to do the work. I think the community has been afraid to get involved. And some of the young men, the community activists that came out for the Ceasefire University one-day training, has begun to talk to the other community members, and we're seeing some momentum moving for a movement to take a stand against violence. And the young men, as well as teenagers, as well as moms, are looking to get involved. And this happened after 19 people came to a ceasefire university training. And it's amazing because in 10 years of trying to move these things, I said, what happened here? Well, it gave them hope, and it gave them a research promising framework that they could go back to Bermuda and begin to open up and talk to people. And I think you did a very good job in selecting the people at the table, because each of those individuals were able to impact their circle of influence. And I think we're getting traction because of that. So I'm excited because now I know one agency will now have more support as we move forward.
Right over here.
My question is for Kurt. I'm curious about how this new batch of police officers, how do you prevent their socialization into old norms related to police violence? Thoughts about that?
Any other questions? Or from panelists for each other? Stacy, go ahead.
Puerto Rico.
Yes, sir.
What were the things that were done in Mexico City that got the drastic change and reduction in violence? The things that you did, especially mentioning you saw similar dynamics from New Haven to Mexico. What were the things that achieved the drastic change?
And then I think, did you have a question?
I did. I was actually curious, Mr. Winterstrom, because yours seems very unique in some respects, because it's we're talking about culture meetings as opposed to internal to one culture meeting. I was just curious whether you or in Sweden, if there are programs in place or if there's been partnering with organizations that have legitimacy in those neighborhoods. I'm sure some efforts have been made. I'm just curious, because that's unique. I've never heard anything like that.
Great. Okay, so why don't we start here with that question, and then I would say if everyone wants to answer the question in 30 seconds of final comments, we'll just go down the panel, please.
Should I start? Okay. Thank you very much. There's absolutely efforts being made. Efforts for the past 2 decades where we've been having a fairly stable development of lethal violence, but a change within the lethal violence so that the traditional forms of lethal violence in a country, part of the North European vodka belt, if you will, has actually gone down thanks to measures. But the levels are kept up because of what's happening in these social areas. So what I think is, what I take with me from these discussions is in the past we have done everything top down, sort of spread out measures over the entire population, and that worked well for although it requires the patience of an angel. We do not have that time now, and which is why we have to learn new methods and new ways of working in the communities and gaining the trust at local level, which is something we haven't done that much in the past.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Quick answer to I think a very tough question, but I think generally speaking, the first thing that I want to highlight was political commitment. And I'm referring not to Mexico City in particular, because the Mexico City experience is happening as we speak. I'm talking about the efforts in Ciudad Juárez in 2010, when the President Calderón put together a task force to address the violence in Ciudad Juárez, which at the time was the most murderous city in the world. President Calderón really put a lot of political will and commitment into that. Showed, I think, in his continuous coming back to the city every month to go through a list of indicators that were putting pressure on the players to really achieve commitments and make sure that those things were moving forward. I think that's the first that I want to highlight. The second is more tactical, it's improved targeting. We understood that with better data, we were able to identify better that even though in a context like Ciudad Juarez, again, violence was concentrated in some places, that it was concentrated among groups and very particular individuals, which led to, I think, my third lesson here, which was bridging the divide that existed between prevention efforts and control efforts. The players were divided in each of their, we had our own kind of corner and we were doing our efforts, but data brought us together and that conversation really yielded interesting results. And the last one for me, which was critical, was to develop the capacity of players to engage tough guys from tough communities. Because most of the players were used to engage, we call them, or we used to call them the good kids from the vulnerable communities. We had to move or push ourselves, to some of us, to better address the needs of those neglected within the neglected. And I think that was probably the most difficult one to do, because that requires, it's not something you just do by willing to do. You have to really change the way you approach the dynamics of stakeholders.
Jeremy, 20 or 30 seconds, just final words.
Just really quickly, just to say that I just want to convey my appreciation for being in this kind of forum. I'll share a very, very quick anecdote. A number of years ago, some World Bank colleagues and I brought the Minister of National Security from Jamaica to a U.S. event. So just talking about that dual exchange of good practices. And it was actually the DOJ's U.S. National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention Summit. He has an epiphany. He goes back. He institutes reforms, and police-driven homicides drop by 40% within the next year. So just to say that these kinds of exchanges yield results. The hope is we start these conversations, we start poking around and exploring to see if, what we can apply in the case of El Salvador and Mexico City, and they can lead to real transformative changes. So just not to underestimate the capacity for real change.
Great, thank you.
Quick answer to your question. So the commission has been working for about 13 months, and they have another 9 months of this government administration. So they've done several things. One is that they have kept all the new graduates in blocks, so they don't spread them all over the country, but they keep them in groups, and then they hand pick the supervisors of those groups. So they've kept them in certain cities and in certain regions of certain cities. So trying to keep them all together. And the next thing they're going to be doing soon is firing all of the oldest 2 generations of the police force. So they're going to get rid of all they call them generals and colonels. And so there'll be a new generation taking over the police force in Honduras. And then the idea is that the commission will continue to work, even in the new administration, depending on who wins. And my little thought, Rachel, is just a little over a month ago, we were invited by city and civil society authorities in Chicago to come up from Honduras to share what we'd done in Honduras with Chicago. And that was very exciting for us, for me and for the people I was traveling with, to see and to start thinking about that it's not, the way we usually think that John Jay is going to teach Honduras things, but that Honduras can teach Chicago things, and that there's stuff going on in Latin America that can help. It's the same gangs, right? It's the same lack of trust of police, many of the same issues in these communities. So, I hope that we can continue to learn from each other.
Thank you. Mr. Ver, the troops are trying to storm the castle here, so.
Gotcha. I'll be brief. Your bumper sticker here at the National Network of Safe Communities is to save lives and save communities. As a political leader, that is not only should be my single central focus every single day. To any Bermudian who may be watching this on live stream or hear about this later on, And I will continue with those efforts with investing in our communities, because this matters. Focused deterrence will work in, I believe, any context, given the right people, given the right amount of focus, and it will work in Bermuda, and we're excited to roll it out there, and continuing to save lives. And we will continue to save those harmed communities who have been harmed for far too long by far too many people, by far too many politicians who have looked the other way, and that will not happen anymore.
Great. Kim, you want to take us home?
Yeah, I just want to say the strength of the network, being here when you think you have answers for yourself, you can share those results with others, and then when you have roadblocks, you share with others, and you get those roadblocks taken away. And I found that is the biggest thing that I'm taking away from this conference, when I thought that we had some barriers that were going to stop us from moving forward. Last night was just phenomenal, where people turned things upside down for me and gave me new ways to look at what I'm going to say an old problem. So I believe in strengthening the community's capacity to prevent violence. And I got a lot of impact and knowledge from just networking with the people that are here. So thank you. Thanks for including us.
So will you join me in a big thank you to our panel?